Munich is synonymous with betrayal. It was in Munich in 1938 that the United Kingdom and France signed off on the annexation of a chunk of Czechoslovakia by Nazi Germany, hoping to forestall a greater conflict. The least attentive student of 20th century history knows how well that worked out. At the Munich Security Conference of 2025, there was much bleak muttering to the effect that at least Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister who infamously shrugged that Hitler's storming of the Czech Sudetenland was a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing, hadn't blamed the Czechs for getting themselves invaded. The tone of the conference was set by a deeply weird harangue from US Vice President JD Vance, which was a notable departure from the usual Munich Security Conference motif of mutual transatlantic backslapping. It was the kind of speech which, within a week of its delivery, had sent European leaders scrambling to 2 emergency summits to consider the prospect of American detachment. In this special episode recorded at the Munich Security Conference, the Foreign Desk reflects on this new reality with current and former office holders. Is the transatlantic alliance still meaningfully intact? Does NATO still guarantee anything? And what happens if the answer to either or both of those questions is no? This is the Foreign Desk.
2025, it's a year of opportunity. It's a year of chance for all of us, because from Russian side, in their own interest, also to stop this war.
We were very fast in the past, with leadership and decisions, and it brought us 2 world wars. So basically, we did everything possible to slow us down, and we managed that quite well. We're really, really slow now.
As Europeans also need to push and to grow up and take a larger responsibility. And I think this new administration is going to pose some tough questions for us as well, that we better rise to the occasion.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. This coming week, February 24th specifically, will mark the 3rd anniversary of the beginning of an invasion of Ukraine, which Russia fondly imagined would see Kyiv conquered within 72 hours. With the assistance of their allies, Ukrainians have resisted Russia's aggression with astonishing ingenuity and courage, and at unimaginable cost. From the end of World War II until maybe last week, there would have been little doubt whose side the United States would take. Well, I'm joined with more on recent developments by Monocle's Julia Lassica. Julia, I'm sure that there is a very long answer to this question, which any Ukrainian could provide us with, but is there a shorter way to explain how it feels as a Ukrainian to watch the last week unfold, and especially seeing President Zelensky sort of openly teased and mocked by the leadership of the United States?
Like being on a roller coaster. And I don't like roller coasters. Like being, euphoric because you've read some scoop somewhere that Kellogg has said something really positive, or suddenly someone in the administration said something that was quite positive towards Ukraine, and then obviously everyone in the office turning around to look at the TV because you just see that Trump has just called Zelensky a dictator. So it's like you're going from one extreme to the other, and then Wednesday evening when those comments came through, I was going home sort of thinking, great, so should my family put contingency plans in for evacuation? Just thinking about their survival. And then the next day reading about Kellogg in Ukraine and thinking, okay, maybe this is a little bit more positive, and reading more positive scoops. So it's just, swinging to and fro constantly.
I guess coming up as well, and what will prompt even more of that sort of thing, is the 3rd anniversary of Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine on February the 24th. It is incredible, given what people assumed 3 years ago, that Ukraine is still extant, that it still has the same leadership, that it is still fighting on, and that Russia has taken really not very much more of it than it had 3 years ago. But among Ukrainians, and I'm sure there are many and varied opinions, but an amount of just plain weariness must be setting in by now. People are only human, and even if there was unstinting support from the United States still incoming, how much more of this would Ukraine have left in it?
Yeah, of course. People are tired. They have really short tempers. They're much ruder to each other than they were 3 years ago because of the stress, the constant stress, the sleep deprivation, etc. One thing I want to make clear is that the Biden administration that preceded this Trump administration was not particularly supportive of Ukraine. There was a very clear policy, which we could sense at the time through their statements, but then was made clear in, a leak or whatever in December. They were giving Ukraine just enough to be able to hold the front line and maybe cede some territory, which Ukraine sadly started to do at the end of last year, but not enough to press forward and not enough to win. So what Biden did really was he didn't give Ukraine enough, and so Ukraine now is in this very weak position. But the thing is, it's not that weak either. Like you said, Ukraine is a liberated, free country. People are living there. The economy is working. Businesses are working. So it's this really weird, unpleasant mix of really positive stories happening and amazing research and amazing defense manufacturing. Ukrainians being able to say that what they could provide to Europe and the US is a really strong army, incredible defense innovations that would make their countries much stronger in terms of security. And then also this mix of we've been given just enough to survive and what we can do with those capabilities.
And just as a final thought, though, and this question again is asked with the due caveat that the current president of the United States might have changed his mind again completely by the time we broadcast this, but does President Zelensky have a good option available to him, or at least a relatively unterrible option? From what you've been able to understand of his statements and movements over the last week and a bit, where do you think he's trying to take this?
I think that now there's a really strong reset of understanding how he talks in public, about not making brash statements, about scaling back this kind of diplomatic style he has, or that lots of people in his administration have, where they say the truth just unfiltered. How we had the comments that they weren't saying thank you enough to the Brits, I think, a few years ago with the then Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. I think that's something that lots of Ukrainians are saying to him and hoping that he'll hear, and we had a Ukrainian MP earlier in the week on Monocle Radio talking about this, is bring more people in from other parties into your cabinet, talk to them, hear what they have to say. Don't just listen to everyone who surrounds you, but bring in other party members. He put sanctions on Ukraine's former president at the end of last week. He has been behaving in a way that doesn't exactly help, with those comments that were being thrown around earlier this week. So just listen to other people and listen to what they have to say.
Julia Lassica, thank you for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. There is little to be said for being made to stand for ages in freezing cold at a security barrier while everybody waits for the US Vice President's motorcade to leave. But at the Munich Security Conference, there is at least a chance you will find yourself shivering next to somebody interesting, which is how we ended up with Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. I began by asking Stephen if he perceived echoes in the current situation of the Bosnian War of the 1990s, when an obviously bewildered United States had said repeatedly to Europe, "Why is this our problem? Can't you fix this? It's your continent."
Yeah, this was the famous quote, "This is the hour of Europe," only the hour of Europe lasts about 5 seconds. And then the Americans had to come figure it out. And it happened in Libya, too, by the way, when the French and British under Cameron came and said, "Oh, we're going to handle Gaddafi," and they couldn't. I mean, they needed NATO, and what was NATO? NATO was American strategic airlift and air refueling and intelligence and ammunition. They'd run out of ammunition in about 3 days. So, these wake-up calls have been heard, but Trump is making them more loudly, I think, and doing it in a very aggressive, politicized way. But Ukraine is interesting. I mean, there is this fear that Trump will just end the war somehow at Ukraine's loss, and say, well, I've ended the bloodshed, and now Europe, you care about Ukraine, you take care of it. And the Europeans are saying, yeah, we need to do more, let's talk about it, but we can't do it alone, we need America to help us. And so the debate, in a way, has started. I don't think the war is about to come to an end anyway, but the debate has started about what security guarantees, which Hegseth said should be in place, what they would look like and who would do what and what would happen if things go wrong. I mean, these are really complicated military analytical decisions that nobody's even begun to think about yet.
That was Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Our next guest is Oleksii Reznikov, who was Ukraine's Minister of Defense when Russia attacked in February 2022 and served in that position until September 2023. I began by asking him what he remembered about the 2022 Munich Security Conference held just a few days before war began.
I would say that the main atmosphere here in Munich was that Ukraine really will fall during 72 hours or 3 days. It was a very hard and strong cognitive bias. And all meeting of our President Zelensky with leaders of different countries, they tried to persuade him to stay here in Europe, not come back to Kiev. But President Zelensky, in his speech, told to the auditory, I got a breakfast with my family in Kiev. I will have a dinner with my family in Kiev as well today. And I think they were surprised. I saw the eyes in the auditory. Because only Ukrainians really believe that we will fight and we will survive.
You were in no doubt about that. You thought that we can resist. We might not be able to actually defeat Russia on the battlefield, but we can resist certainly longer than 72 hours?
We didn't get any chances. Our destiny was to fight and survive, because what other case or what other the scenario should be? To give up, Minsk 3, what else? And President Zelensky asked all leaders, okay, guys, if they will cross the border, what you will do? Or we will switch on the sanctions. Okay, let's do it right now. No, we will do it after the full-scale invasion. So you're telling us about that this invasion imminent, but you didn't try to stop them in reality. So it's very, very specific moment that you have a lot of information about the preparation of the Russians, but simultaneously your partners staying without any real active position.
Do you have a sense of where the United States wants to steer this, though? Because you're right to point that out. This is the question hanging over this Munich Security Conference, i.e., is the US about to throw Ukraine under the bus?
I'm a negotiator, so it's one of my job when I was a lawyer in a law company and after that as a local authority. Always, if you're sitting at the table, you have to recognize your interests and needs and interests and needs of your vis-a-vis. This is bilateral negotiation table. So all sides have their interest. So in the interest of the United States to be the leader of the civilized world and, sorry for my French, to push European countries to pay for it. It's an interest of the United States because the main donor of the NATO country allies is the United States, certainly. They're trying to deliver the message to the European countries, to NATO countries, guys, you have to pay for that because it's a question of the European security, first of all, the war in Ukraine. If Ukraine will fall, Russians will keeping there going and they will trying to restore or rebuild Berlin Wall again. It's obviously also for me. Washington, D.C., this administration trying to deliver this message. It's clear, guys, Europeans, you have to pay for it.
But that can't happen soon, and it won't happen soon. And in the meantime, how patient is President Trump likely to be about allowing Ukraine to fight on?
It's very difficult to calculate the timing, but my gut feeling, I'm a lawyer, I don't like to make some forecasts,
sure.
But I'm trying to use the facts. But my background probably give me the optimistic feeling. 2025, it's a year of opportunity. It's a year of chance for all of us. Because from Russian side, in their own interest, also to stop this war. regarding the economical situation. If you will check the official statement of the central bank and Minister of Finance, they have a very big problem in their economy. So for them, it's very important to stop this war also.
But where's the opportunity there for Ukraine? Because Ukraine would end up losing territory. It would need to cede territory to Russia.
Yes, I think that the final version of the amicable agreement would be very, very discussable. And we will need to rise up our priorities of our interest. So sovereignty, independence, and security guarantees, real security guarantees for us for the next future. Because Budapest Memorandum, it's nothing for us, for Ukrainians. If we will not have the real security guarantees architecture, Russians will come again. They will get 5 years, 7 years, and they will come again.
But are you confident that Ukraine is going to have that much of a say in how things pan out in the near future? Because what strikes me as not unimaginable is that your European allies might start to think, well, is the choice we have either keeping the United States interested in maintaining the defence of the rest of Europe or supporting Ukraine? They might prefer to think, well, okay, we tried with Ukraine, we failed, but we can't defend ourselves without the US. So if that's the choice we have to make, that's the choice we have to make.
I think it's a real interest of the European countries to be with Ukraine, to continue support us with the finance, weaponry, to invest to their security on the territory of Ukraine. Because Ukraine really became the eastern flank of the Europe.
But if they have to feel like they have to make a choice between Ukraine and the United States?
I think this is not a choice. It's also on an interest of the United States if Europe will spend money for their security. If Europe will spend money for their security, developing the security shield in Ukraine, in Lithuania, in Poland, and other countries, for the United States would be the real sign that they seriously recognize the old threats. And they will really edit their percentage from the GDP to the NATO for the security allies. So it will be not conflict between United States and Europe. It would be good deal.
Oleksii Reznikov, former Defence Minister of Ukraine, thank you for joining us on the Foreign Desk. You're back with the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our next guest is Alexander Sushko, Executive Director of Ukraine's International Renaissance Foundation. I began by asking if there is a semi-optimistic outlook for Ukraine, perhaps akin to West and East Germany, where Ukraine let some of its territory go in the interests of peace and anticipates getting it back eventually because nobody likes living under Russian subjugation very much.
There are several analogies like this, but I'm rather skeptical about this analogy because, first of all, Germans remained to be Germans, even in the Eastern Germany.
True.
In this case, if they occupy in power, and we know it from what they do now at the occupied territories, they provide policy of very strong Russification of the population. Forceful change of their identity. They organize camps for the children to educate them, to force them to forget their identity, Ukrainian identity, and to accept Russian identity. So unfortunately, if it takes, for example, 40, 50 years, people of these territories will be totally changed. So through migration and through education, unfortunately, different trends. And some of them make me optimistic, and some of them are worrying. So, first of all, really, this Ukrainian society, maybe first time in its history, recognized finally who they are and why they are together. So the reason why we live in one country. And so it happened that this feeling is quite strong. And so people have motivation, have reason, with different backgrounds, certainly. But they have a reason to live together, and that makes me think that the final decision that has been taken by this group the people. And it makes better conditions for development. Because if the people feel themselves and integrated as a people, it's better to have policy, it's better to have stronger, I would say, political system, better sense of direction, where we are moving to. So there is no longer this debate, either we go west or east, so there's no longer issue. So that's quite, people are quite sure that we belong to Europe, that we belong to Ukraine, and this is some sort of national consensus on the basic issues, which never happened before. Because if you looked at Ukraine 10 years ago, it was more like a mixture of different identities, mixture of conflicting pictures of the universe, I would say. So now it's more homogeneous.
Sure.
More sense of belonging to Europe. What is maybe challenging is that the trauma of the war. It's very deep.
Yeah.
And society is so traumatized in different means. Even those who are at the front line, it's more than 1 million people who are engaged in the battlefield. Some of them already returned, wounded, disabled. There will be a big group of people directly involved, and they will be demobilized. The problem of their return to normal life, and how society accepts them. So this is not only a problem of those people who are at the front line, but the rest of society, to what extent it is ready to accept so many people with a totally different experience. Yeah. Then there will be risks of this kind of destabilization because of the new divides. So we solved the problem of the old divides, but we will get new divides in this society. Those who were in the army and those who were not. Those who spent good time in Germany and those who stayed in Ukraine. Those who were affected, who lost lives of their relatives, or who lost their homes, and who didn't lose. So there will be new divides, and I already see this, the origin of new dividing lines within the society. So suddenly post-war society, post-war democracy is something which we never seen. We don't know how it will work. I understand there will be a lot of challenges in the first years after the end of the war, how to stabilize it, how to go back to normality.
Alexander Sushko, Executive Director of Ukraine's International Renaissance Foundation, thanks for joining us. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. For readily understandable reasons, the three tiny Baltic states have long been insistent that the rest of Europe has been complacent about both the threat from Russia and the support of the United States. More entitled, if less thrilled than most, to be able to say, "We told you so," is Gabrielius Landsbergis, former Foreign Minister of Lithuania, now member of the Munich Security Conference Advisory Council. I began by asking if, right now, without the United States as the ultimate guarantor of its security, can Europe actually look after itself?
No.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. Look, I don't want to spoil anybody's day, but I mean, Ukrainians have, I can imagine ammunition for a month or two, if the current intensity holds. Right now, it's a bit dropped, so maybe that could be prolonged a little bit. If U.S. stops the assistance right after the quote-unquote deal is made, and then Ukrainians turn to Europe and say, "Okay, are you able to provide us just ammunition?" We can't. We just don't have it. I mean, Czechs were busy, buying all over the world, and they bought, as President Pavel yesterday said, 1.5 million, something like that, right? So that is the best that we could do. North Koreans provide way more ammunition to Russians than Europe.
I mean, I know that you and other politicians from the Baltic states, for all the obvious reasons, have been beating this drum for a long time, and it can't, I guess, be any satisfaction in being able to now to say to people, "See, we were right all along." But What's your sense, looking back on the last few years, of why people haven't wanted to listen? Is it they just didn't believe that Russia is actually a meaningful threat, or did they just not want to have to go back to their voters and explain, look, this is a thing and we are going to have to make some difficult and expensive choices?
That's a good question. We can bash ourselves that Europe, doesn't have leaders currently, of Churchillian type, the ones that will say, we'll never surrender, we'll fight, not rest in the beaches. But there is a reason why we don't have leaders. There's a reason why we're so slow.
Which would be?
Well, because we were very fast in the past, with leadership and decisions, and it brought us 2 world wars. So basically, we did everything possible to slow us down, and we managed that quite well. We're really, really slow now, right? And and now when history is literally being written every single minute in front of our eyes, we have to convene a Foreign Affairs Council, first informal today, then formal tomorrow, then leaders meeting a bit later in the evening, and then to discuss the agenda. By the end, when we're done with that, most probably we'll have news from Washington that the situation is already different, and then in Ukraine and in Russia. So that's why we're fundamentally not suited to the situation. We don't have the instruments, so it's not just about leadership. You can have a leader like Kaja Kallas saying, we will never leave Ukraine. Sure, just give me some ammunition, and it will be fine at this point. We don't. So all is left, possibly, is the words. I don't want to sound that this is it. Just pack your things and let's all leave. It is possible, but then we need to answer some fundamental questions. Like, really, how do we operate in this situation? Is there a chance to, for this extraordinary time, somehow, give extraordinary powers, I don't know, to somebody, so that people could be able to make decisions on at least financing, on industry at least, on some parts of our, the way that continent functions, so that we would be able to, to respond to the crisis at hand.
Countries could do that unilaterally, though, outside of a NATO deployment.
They could, but the question will be, if Lithuania sends troops to Ukraine, can Russians retaliate to Lithuania, and whether that will be an Article 5 situation or not? If it doesn't, that basically destroys NATO, and it is very difficult to convince your people that we're sending our men. And
is that potentially right now, though, the inbuilt flaw of that NATO setup? That realistically, ultimately, the decision about whether Article 5 is a thing or not is in the hands of the President of the United States.
That's a bit outside. I'm still working in the domain of believing in Article 5. And I'm just asking whether extraterritorial operation of NATO in Ukraine, outside NATO territory, not NATO operation, but, bilateral, European, call it what you want, will we be, ready to meet Russian escalation if that happens? Basically, if we are going to control the escalation as such. So, but that works within Article 5 framework, right? So, President von der Leyen and many others, said that, okay, so we are entering the transactional phase of global environment. Okay, I would probably have to admit that it sounds like truth. But then the tiny question, how does Article 5 work in the transactional world? Because the Article 5 is not a transaction, it's trust. And we have just to trust, which is pacta sunt servanda, and this is a very ancient principle that you put your signature, I put my signature, and that's it. And we all believe that we know it, Putin knows it, and this is what makes it stable. If we say, now it's transactional.
And in the scenario you're describing, though, it's very easy to see how a president like Donald Trump would frame that as Lithuania is trying to bounce the United States into World War III, and I'm not going to do it.
Yeah, well, when we're saying that we are in the world of complete uncertainty, that means that we actually don't know what will happen. And it's almost impossible to calculate that. So the way that I function, I better prepare for the worst scenario and then celebrate if it doesn't happen rather than the opposite.
That was Gabrielius Landsbergis, former foreign minister of Lithuania. Our final guest is Pål Jonson, Sweden's Minister of Defence, who had met with his fellow NATO defence ministers in Brussels shortly before arriving in Munich. I began by asking what sense he was able to get of the new United States Secretary of Defence, Pete Hegseth.
Very clear-cut messages from Secretary. He was stating Europe has to prepare itself to take a larger responsibility for its own security. It has to prepare itself to take a larger responsibility for Ukraine and Ukraine support. Article 5 and keeping NATO strong, that is valid. I think if with this administration as well, it has probably a more narrow definition of what is U.S. national interest. And it's clear that this is an administration where it's America first, and if you also want to collaborate and have access to this administration, you better deliver on your defense investments, on your size of your Ukraine support, and on the capability targets and so forth.
I mean, this is where I can allow you to do a little bit of an advertisement for Sweden, because I'm wondering if you think that's maybe less of an adjustment for Sweden than a lot of European countries, because of course until a couple of years ago Sweden had taken care of its own defences and had taken responsibility for itself. And I know America's been saying this especially since 2016, but America's also been saying this to Europe basically since 1949.
Well, we doubled our defense budget in 4 years, so we're one of the ones who've done the most in that regard inside NATO, and we don't do that because allies are telling us or US is telling us. We do it because we need to, and it's because it's paramount to our own security. We also have a very substantial Ukraine support, so our latest support packages was the biggest so far with 1.2 billion euros, and we've been increasing it for every year, and we try to hit the ground running as a new ally. We are 11 months into our journey as a new ally, and we already sent a mechanized battalion to Latvia, and we're going to be the 9th country inside NATO who has a responsibility for what is called the FLF Finland. It's the organization of the defense of Finland. So we try to be a security provider into the alliance, which Secretary Hegseth recognized, and I think it's good for our bilateral relationship.
I mean, the mechanized battalion you mentioned, which is in Latvia, does obviously indicate, or I guess remind Sweden, not that I'm suggesting you needed reminding, that membership of NATO does have responsibilities as well as benefits. And given that, are you maybe more worried than you might have been 3 or 4 years ago that Ukraine might be bounced into an unjust peace? Because one of the effects of any ceasefire on any kind of Russian terms is that it would free up tens of thousands of Russian troops to go and park themselves maybe not all that far from where your troops now are.
Well, I always say supporting Ukraine is both the right thing to do and the smart thing to do, and it's of course about upholding common values, about European security order and assuring that we don't have a Europe where might is right, but for us also it's an investment into our own security, because we see Ukraine as the shield against the Russian military expansion, and that's why we are so adamant about continuing supporting Ukraine. I think that the worst thing that could happen for Europe's security order would be a bad deal for the Ukrainians that would embolden the Russian and weaken the Ukrainians, and then we'll all be much worse off. Therefore, it's absolutely crucial that we are involved into the peace negotiation, us as Europeans, because we provided 60% of the military support for Ukraine the last year, and we are, of course, very much affected by the end result of these negotiations as well.
But if the United States does bounce Ukraine into a bad deal, and that does seem likelier than not, does Europe really have a choice except but to go along with it? Can Europe instead decide, no, we will keep helping Ukraine to survive whether or not the United States wants any part of this?
The best thing that could happen is if we can get an alignment between the European positions and the American positions, because then we can strengthen Ukraine and then weaken the Russians. So that's really the ideal. And I think a lot of the negotiations and discussions going on here in Munich is actually all about that, because this is a new administration, and I think it's feeling its way forward a little bit and see how we respond to some of the initiatives as well. So I do see a degree of flexibility, and that's why we want these kinds of dialogues. But once again, we have to make sure that the Ukrainians it should be on the conditions of the Ukrainians, and if they want to seize territory, that has to be a decision that the Ukrainians do themselves. Now, I take note that President Zelensky has opened for that, but they have to be part of the negotiations. Otherwise, we're just going to end up strengthening the Russians, and that's going to give us a lot of more security problems.
So you don't have any concerns that Sweden's joined NATO just in time to watch it unravel?
No, not at all. I mean, we are grateful that we're part of this alliance, that we are at a seat at the table, that I could sit down and meet Secretary Hegseth early on at the NATO ministerial, that we could sit and talk with my good friend Rustem Umerov, the Ukrainian defense minister. We're part of the negotiations. You have to have a seat at the table, and if you're outside the alliance, you don't have a seat at the table. In conclusion, that now we have 31 more allies to strengthen our security with. So this has strengthened Nordic-Baltic security, has strengthened our armed forces, and it has made us a much more responsible stakeholder of the European security order. I mean, this is the first time since 1700 that we have troops in Latvia. You know, this is a big moment for me to go and visit those, but we come in peace, and we do it to help the Latvians and the rest of the allies to deter Russia.
Well, I was just going to say, your troops were there in very different circumstances, circa 1700. But just as a final thought, and I know you're not going to do that thing of telling other NATO countries how they should govern themselves, but do you get the feeling that maybe not enough has yet been done generally across the continent to prepare publics for the scale of what they may need to face? And obviously Sweden, in keeping with its tradition of self-reliance, has always been keen on telling the people to be prepared. I know you issued an updated version of your civil defence leaflet, I think in November, which had a much greater emphasis on preparing for war. I mean, it explicitly says this is what everybody needs to have ready, and this is what everybody needs to be prepared to do. Should we be seeing more of that across Europe?
To my mind, that has been very important in Sweden. I always lose much more sleep about not conveying that the things are risky than trying to scaremonger. So when we sent out that folder in 2017, a lot of people thought that, this would be, people would get very worried and so forth. That hasn't been our experience. I'm much more worried about the failure of imagination, that people don't understand that actually an armed attack could happen to us or to any of the allies. I don't say it's imminent or anything like that, but that building awareness, I think, is absolutely crucial. I think it is also clear that this is a new administration coming in from Washington. They're going to be asking a lot of tough questions to us. They're going to look at our defense investments. They're going to look at our Ukraine support, and they're going to say, it's great that you're increasing your expenditures, but where are your brigades? What is your industrial output and so forth? And we, as Europeans, also need to push and to grow up and take a larger responsibility. And I think this new administration is going to pose some tough questions for us as well, that we better rise to the occasion.
I was struck by one line in that leaflet, and I think I quote it more or less accurately, which told Swedish people, if you hear news bulletins to the effect that Sweden has surrendered, don't believe it.
Exactly. That's our approach. Rest assured that that's a core message. It was during the Cold War that don't believe the enemy trying to convey a message that we surrender, because we won't. We will fight to the last soldier.
That was Pål Jonson, Sweden's Minister of Defence. And that's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.